And welcome to a Canadian Patriot Podcast with Lucy Komisar, who is very kind to join me today in a discussion about something that is very important, not only for Canadians, but for humanity in general, which is, I mean, the thing that got us started in this dialogue was that we have a mutual friend named John Helmer, who many people have already listened to in an interview that we did a couple of weeks ago on the matter of what's really behind the story of what's going on the ground in Ukraine. Who are the manipulators? What are the geopolitical historic currents shaping the contours of our current situation that's driving us towards an existential crisis, which is eminently solvable, but yet because people are afraid or incapable of seeing some of the more subtle causal agencies behind the scenes, we walk right into the slaughterhouse. And we've been doing this repeatedly for years and years and years. As a species, humanity has been walking into tragedy again and again because we refuse to look behind the surface. Lucy Komisar is an incredible journalist who has decades and decades of experience looking behind the surface, who has not acted the fool and has been trying to help people understand how they themselves could also avoid tragedy and look at how these subtle fingers are manipulating them. Lucy is an award-winning journalist. She has the Loeb Award, which is one of the most esteemed awards you can get in journalism. She has, again, worked on specifically this particular matter much more than most other people that I've ever met, which is the matter of Bill Browder. Mm-hmm. And today's war takes on not just a symmetrical, conventional nuclear component, but there's economic war, there's psychological war, intelligence warfare, all being conducted at the same time. One of the key components of the economic warfare has been sanctions, which has been used sloppily and brutally and nonstop, especially over the past decades, and especially in regards to Russia. Bill Browder comes in as a figure who, as I mentioned, Canadians will have special interest in this particular discussion because he will be invited, and maybe by the time this interview is broadcast, he will have already spoken at in Ontario, where there is the CFA, a conference by the Chartered Financial Accountants. Am I getting that right? Is that the CFA?
Yeah, and they're supposed to be a higher level than the ordinary accountants. So one should really depend on their ability to sniff out fraud.
You would hope, right? I mean,
that's their job.
But they have extended an invitation to none other than Bill Browder himself to speak at their event, which is, I think, a good sign of why our society is in so much financial problems, perhaps as well as geopolitical problems. But with that aside, Lucy has written a lot about that. We're going to have a lot of links, especially to her site, the Komisar Scoop, in the description box of this video. Lucy, thank you so much for taking the time. And I was hoping maybe to kick this little brief interview off, you could say a little something about yourself, your approach to journalism, and what stands out from what has become modern corporate journalism, which is polluting the waters today.
Well, when the 60s civil rights movement started, I was a college student. I went to Mississippi because I heard they needed someone to work on the Mississippi Free Press, a pro-civil rights newspaper weekly that had been started by people in the movement. When I got there was really only one other person and a half. I became the editor, and I stayed there as editor for a year. And that made me want to be a journalist. Before that, I was going to be a high school French and Spanish teacher because my mother said, you have to be a high school teacher. That's what girls do. You just have to pick your subject. Well, I decided to be a journalist. I couldn't get a job on a paper in New York or a news agency. I tried to get a job at UPI, and the bureau chief, Tommy Zumbo, who died some years ago, said, sorry, Lucy, we already have 3 girls. So I went freelance, and I started writing freelance for the Village Voice. I finally got a job at the Bergen Record, and I stayed there for 3 years. That's in a small town in New Jersey, in Hackensack, New Jersey. And at the end of my stay there, and I wasn't planning to quit, I went with several reporters on a trip organized by Oxfam. We went to El Salvador and Nicaragua, where the Americans were conducting a proxy war against governments they thought were too left-wing. In fact, in El Salvador, at one point, I rode with some of the church women in the van that was later found burned after they were raped and killed. Working in New Jersey didn't make any sense to me, and I went back to being freelance. Then I got more and more interested in what was going on in other countries, and I went to several places, different parts of the world, including the Philippines, Zaire, and Haiti. And in each one, the opposition movements, because I was looking at democratic oppositions to the US supported dictators, the oppositions told me the dictator had looted the country and the money was in Swiss banks. I didn't know anything about this system, which I learned was the offshore secret banking system. I began to investigate it. I never read about it in the media, and I had a hard job selling any stories about this. Then the issue of Jewish money in Swiss banks came up, and I had a lead in. I wrote an article which was published by the Los Angeles Times saying this issue of money hidden in secret accounts is not only about Jewish money, the money of survivors, but it's an international system, and it hides the money of kleptocrats, tax evaders, all kinds of drug traffickers, all kinds of bad guys. And I got into writing about the offshore system. About 10 years after that, I got called by somebody who was making a film on naked short selling, which I had never heard of. Short selling is when you sell a stock you don't own. You're allowed to do that, but you're supposed to buy it and sell it within a few days to whoever paid you for it and doesn't know that that person never got the stock. The deal is you think the stock is going down in price, so you will pay less money than you were paid for it. But the problem with naked shorting is they don't ever buy the stock. And under the US law, even if people don't ever get the stock, they are given an entitlement. So now you have two stocks that can be sold where there was one. One is a real stock and one is an entitlement. Well, the more there is in the marketplace, the lower the price goes. You drive the price down. And that's what naked short selling did. And I talked about offshore in that film because the offshore system was used by the cheaters to move the stocks and to move their money. And then also, I couldn't find any mainstream media to run any stories about naked short selling until finally the GameStop saga came, and that became so big. There have been several movies, documentary, feature film. There's another feature film coming up. I was able to sell 2 stories on naked short selling and GameStop to the American Prospect, which is an online and print, and obviously left of center. It wasn't mainstream, but at least it got that far. And the latest one is a story where I've done the first one. You can find it on my website, the Komisar Scoop for 100 Reporters, and it's about the corruption of for-profit life insurance companies. In this case, Athene, which is owned by Apollo, one of the world's largest funds, and MetLife, it's the U.S. Largest life insurance company, and Accordia, which was started by Goldman Sachs. And there's another story coming out. It's a 2-part story, but of course the mainstream media has not written about this either. This is on 100 Reporters, an investigative site. So for the last 40 years, I have focused on aspects of the Western oligarchy that manipulate the financial system, that abuse, that steal, and it's not reported in the mainstream press. I think because it's that mainstream press is also run by oligarchs who are friendly to the people who are doing the dirty deeds. And I have found that the way to get these stories out is to use independent media and also do videos like I'm doing with you.
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the benefits that the internet has provided us. It's sort of like a wild west frontier where you can get around a lot of the corporate strangleholds that had been formally embedded for many decades in who controls what voices are heard or not heard. I remember when I was little, you only had a few channels to watch TV, and I mean, if something wasn't approved to be on one of the news shows, there wasn't really much you could do about that. Or there's only a few printed news magazines that you could purchase physically, and if you didn't find the truth there, what else do you do? So there is this interesting phenomenon here that we're capitalizing on, which is nice. You've planted so many seeds for future interviews. I didn't expect that to come up as your answer, but there's definitely a lot to unpack. And I think what we'll do is we'll plant a lot of links in the description box for anybody who wants to dig more into some of the elements of what you brought up regarding the 100 reporters or some of your work on the international shell companies and offshore banking, which is, I think it definitely situated you into a place where you were better able to appreciate than most the role of this figure who this interview is about, Bill Browder. Mm-hmm. And in a few days, as we mentioned, the Chartered Financial Analysts of Canada will be giving a platform to Bill Browder to speak. You have spent the last few years doing a lot of work on him and exposing the lies of Bill. I mean, Browder has been sold to the West as a bit of a anti-corruption crusader, a hero. I mean, it goes on and on. He's written fluff pieces about himself, or maybe he's had ghostwriters who have just celebrated himself as this great James Bond-like ladies' man spy. And I mean, there's something somewhat pathetic about the character, but he has been prolific and people have been very much duped. Can you say a little bit about who he is exactly and why it's important to understand his story as a figure who has driven the passage of a new type of sanction that we mentioned earlier, of the Magnitsky Acts?
Well, Bill Browder is, I would say, is the world's most brilliant con man. But he comes to it at a time when the con that he is pushing is desired by people in power. I first ran into him 2 decades ago. In 2000, I got a U.S. National Research Council grant, that was a government grant, to study money laundering in Russia. So I went there, I found it. The crook I discovered was Bill Browder, an American investor who had changed his passport to the UK to avoid taxes on his profits. In the UK, you don't have to pay taxes on money in offshore places. That's partly because the UK runs so many of the Channel Islands, the Grand Cayman. They are one of the top countries that runs offshore. So you can put your money there, you don't get taxed. In the US, you get taxed even if you put your money in Grand Cayman. Of course, people use shell companies and they don't report it, but legally you're supposed to report it. So Browder changed his citizenship to the UK. Now, when I discovered, when I was in Moscow, it's when I first discovered the Avisma story, and it took me a long time to get the documentation and find somebody to run it, which again was 100 reporters. Avisma is a Russian titanium company, and it was owned by Mikhail Khodorkovsky, another crook, and he was using transfer pricing. That means you set up a shell company offshore in the Isle of Man, and you sell your product, in this case titanium, which is used in airplanes. Boeing is a big customer, and you sell it to this shell company on the Isle of Man at a price below the market. So when you send money back for taxes on your profits or dividends to your minority shareholders, it's on the fake low price. Then the shell company sells the titanium on the market at the real price, and you siphon off the differences. When Browder, together with Kenneth Dart, who's a billionaire from his grandfather's Dart Cups, and there was a small investor in the U.S., they bought Khodorkovsky's majority share of Avisma. And part of the deal was that they would continue the Isle of Man transfer pricing. And this is documented. And I was able to find the documents because what happened was some of these crooks, there's no honor among thieves. The person who was running the shell company in the Isle of Man is named Peter Bond, who is infamous in this area. And he was supposed to send the profits, the skim, back to Dart and Browder and their other partner named Francis Baker. But he didn't do it. So the argument was the deal in October? Was it finalized or finalized in December? And what about the money in between? And he didn't send it to them. I'm sure he didn't send it to Khodorkovsky either. They sued him, Dart Browder. They sued him in the Isle of Man. Now, in the Isle of Man, a civil suit, unlike in the US, or I'm sure in Canada, is secret. The only people that can see the documents and the suit are the parties to the suit. What happened was a company called VSMPO, a Russian company that used titanium in its production, bought Avisma, and they had a lawyer go through Avisma's documents, and the lawyer was a Philadelphia lawyer who also has an office in Moscow. And when I talked to him, he said, "Lucy, I couldn't believe it. They had me go to the lawyer's office in London and look through the documents, and they showed me all the documents that said that Avisma and the people that own it were cheating my client, which was VSMPO, because what they now saw was the Isle of Man lawsuit documents." And in my website, I have a story about Avisma, and I link to the documents, and they're quite wonderful. And basically, at one point, Browder is talking to Peter Bond, saying, "I think we can make a deal on this. We can manage something. You know, basically, he's saying, I know, I'm a crook, you're a crook, we'll manage this." Well, they settled, because once VSMPO and their lawyer, Bruce Marks, saw the documents, there was no case. They filed a RICO suit in New Jersey, and Dart and Browder and Baker, they settled. And according to Marks, they're not allowed to say. It's always the settlement is confidential, but he said, "We were very pleased with the settlement." I mean, there was no case. So that was the first story I wrote, and where I realized that Browder was a crook. And I had actually asked him about that when I was in Moscow. I happened to go to a meeting run by a law firm, and there were journalists invited, and he was a speaker there. And I asked him about this, and his natural response is, "Anytime I'm lashing into the corruption of Russia, there are always people supporting that who are attacking me because I'm against corruption." Actually, I was attacking him because he was totally involved in corruption. And at the coffee break, the Russian reporters who were there laughed about the whole deal because they know he was a total crook. So then you get that. I began to investigate Browder more after I did the Avisma story. Well, the next thing that comes up is what's known as I call it the Browder-Magnitsky hoax. Browder had set up his shell companies that were holding stocks. It's perfectly legitimate to have a company that holds the stocks you're buying and selling. He put it in Kalmykia. Now, that is a Buddhist state or department in Russia that gives big tax breaks to companies if they have at least half of their employees are disabled. And he didn't have any employees in the company. This had several companies. They were just to hold stocks. But he sent Magnitsky, who is his accountant, assigned to him by Firestone Duncan, the accounting firm. But he had the Hermitage account, and that Hermitage was the Browder company. Magnitsky went up to Kalmykia to find people who could say that they were disabled and that they were working for Browder's companies. And he did. He got about 4 people. Well, they were manual laborers. They did things like one was a gardener, for example. Eventually, of course, the government, the inspectors found out. In the early 2000s, they found out what was going on. They were investigating. And initially, and it turned out that the money was 40 million taxes evaded because they were taking this huge tax break. But Browder stalled. He also paid off a local tax investigator who later recanted and admitted. So finally the case moved to the federal investigators, not the local, and they were investigating this. And in 2006, they had an interrogation of Magnitsky where they were asking him about this. And so this was this was the importance of this, the case as it comes out, because we'll get a little bit later. I think maybe this part we should go to the point of where the hoax gets into detail.
Sure.
But that
might be appropriate. Yeah, I mean, let's go with the flow. I mean, I think you're setting the stage very much for the Magnitsky hoax.
Well, I want to say that when you hear what he did, I will show you that the Browder hoax is the first pillar of Russiagate, this Browder Magnitsky hoax. Now, remember the other pillars. This was in December 2012 when the Magnitsky Act was passed.
Well, maybe we could just say quickly, so Sergei Magnitsky, for those who don't know, is a fellow who Bill Browder says was his lawyer, an anti-corruption whistleblower inside of Russia, who was so effective and was such a thorn in the side of Putin and his oligarch lackeys that they had him killed. They arrested him in, I think it was 2008 or 9?
Yeah, no. So let me, if we want to go in order, so the issue was the Magnitsky, the hoax was the first thing that Browder did was not pay the taxes, but then there was that started in about 2002, and he just refused to pay the taxes. But then there was another thing, another corrupt scheme that he got involved in, and that's called the tax refund fraud. And what happened there was, and this had been done by some other companies. I talked to a lawyer named Andrei Pavlov, and he admitted that he worked in this scheme, and he had actually worked on another scheme. And what they did was the following. They would do a collusive lawsuit. One company would say that they were being sued by another company, and it was a fake company, and you didn't fulfill your contract, and therefore you owe us this money. And the victim company, which would in this case Hermitage, would say, yes, you're right, and we are paying you this amount of money. And it was 1 billion in profits in 2006. And the demand of the company was the fake company, you owe us 1 billion. And they, of course, didn't go to court and say, we don't owe you anything. Of course, we will, but it's collusive lawsuit. So then it was the money of 2006, but this case was in 2007. And they filed at the end of the year for a refund from the Russian treasury for 320 million, which would have been the taxes they paid if they really had $1 billion in profits. Now, Browder says his companies were stolen, and this was done by others. He said there was, in the middle of 2007, about June, there was an investigation, a search of his office and of the company where Magnitsky worked, Firestone Duncan, and that was part of the tax evasion investigation. And that was in June of 2007. And they took papers, hard drives, normal, what you would do in such an investigation. Browder said that the tax investigators used the documents to steal his companies. Number one, there's no proof of that. And second, it's not possible. Under Russian law, the only way you can change ownership is if the original owner goes in person to the company's house and signs documents, I am switching my company to this, or if there is a power of attorney given to somebody who may do it remotely by mail or by email. And that was not done. All they said, can you imagine what would happen? Some unhappy person in an office who has access to documents in the office, steal some documents from the office, go someplace and says, this is now my company. The whole thing is absurd to begin with. Yeah. And yet he tells this story and nobody says, you're crazy. You can't. What country would allow anybody with some documents to go in and steal the company? You cannot do it. You can't do it in Russia. You can't do it in Canada. You can't do, there are very specifics about selling a company.
Well, I think they're really preying off of people's ignorance of Russia and their presumptions or prejudices that Russia is this land of Mordor with orcs, and it's just so absurd,
they're
corrupted,
not even
unhuman
thinking
that anything could
no,
happen. Yeah.
anything can happen, but they're not even thinking. Okay,
Yeah.
this is what really happened. So powers of attorney were provided to Browder's Cyprus shells, which owned these shell companies, and they were provided to a man named Oktay Gazanov. And the person who was finally brought to justice by the Russians for this whole scam was named Viktor Markelov. Markelov said that Gazanov was his collaborator. He also said he worked with a man named Sergei Leonidovich. Magnitsky's name is Sergei Leonidovich Magnitsky. So the power of attorney was provided from Browder's Cyprus companies. He said that this was forgery, but Yana Alexandru, an employee of the Cyprus company that set up Browder's shells, swore in a deposition in U.S. federal court. She recognized her signature. And there is, therefore, this July 2007 sale agreement. And this is clearly what happened. And it's clear to me, persuasive, that Browder and Magnitsky colluded on the tax refund scam. And this was the major argument for Browder to say that he keeps on saying that he was victimized by this scam. In effect, the other thing nobody thinks about, Browder has admitted, and even said it in one of his books, that he had moved all his money out of the country, out of Russia, after he lost his visa. So in 2006, all the money was moved out. So if any of his companies were taken over by anybody, there was zero in them. So how could he be the victim? But he has written that he was the victim of this scam. Again, the people who write about this in the mainstream media, nobody says, well, how could you have lost any money in this scam since the year before you moved all your money out of Russia and you've actually written that? Nobody asks these questions because it's not convenient. So that is those are the two main issues. Now, the second part you asked about, I think, was why about Magnitsky being arrested, right?
Yeah,
that was the second part.
That was the second part. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So he was, we know, a key figure in this tax evasion case. First of all, there's no evidence he exposed anything. He was interrogated 3 times, once in 2006, twice in 2008, both before the arrest. He never said anything accusing anybody. And these documents are filed in U.S. federal court. I put them on my website, the Komisar Scoop. So he makes allegations that he accused people, but there's absolutely no evidence that he accused anybody. But nobody ever checks that. I mean, it's all there. It's translated into English, and it's accepted by the U.S. court, meaning that it's a correct translation. The translator has to swear that it's a correct translation of the Russian. If there was anything wrong, the opposition in the case, which was the U.S. Justice Department, which was acting as Browder's proxy, because he wasn't officially in the case, but that's why there was a case. Therefore, there's no evidence he did anything. Now, what's really interesting is Browder is always bringing complaints. He brought a complaint to the European Court of Human Rights. This is not a Russian court. This is a European court. And he asked them to opine on whether or not Magnitsky had been badly treated. Well, they said that he was legitimately arrested. They have a report was August 2019. So we're talking 3 years ago, August 2019. They said he was lawfully arrested. He said there was evidence he was planning to leave the country. They said, quote, the accusations were based on documentary evidence, and it was clear that he was going to leave the country. They had found that they said there was evidence of the non-payment of taxes by those companies, and that there were statements by several disabled persons who confessed to sham work for the companies. And one of them testified he had been in contact with Magnitsky, had received money from him, had helped him find other sham employees, and that Magnitsky had told them what to say if they were questioned by authorities, and asked them to participate as a witness in the tax dispute. This is the European Court of Human Rights saying this. This is not some friend of Putin, right? Do you think that's getting headlines in no, not in the US media. So that's the that end of that part of the story. Now, the second part of the story is the death story. He was legitimately arrested. He was detained as a witness. The other people from Browder's group had all left the country. They were all in London. He was the last one. They needed him to give evidence on how these deals had been done. So now, whenever they talk about what their jails were like, this detention, I always like to read about what was Guantanamo like? What was Abu Ghraib like? What are the jails in Mississippi and Alabama like? I want to tell you, the jail in Moscow, which was 100 years old, it was a building 100 years old, where he was kept, I think it was equivalent or even better than some of those other places. And that's where he was. Okay, so not wonderful, but probably better than most of what you get, at least in the US. So more on that. So he died. Well, he had pancreatitis and he did not get great treatment. And that is true. And all the reports, including by Russian authorities, they all say that he did not get great treatment. And after under a year, he died. Now, he could have gotten out if Browder had paid the taxes. He was there only to investigate Browder's cheating on taxes. And if Browder, and he was there because of Browder, and he died because of Browder, because if he had gotten out, if the taxes had been paid, there would have been no case, he would have gotten out. So every time Browder cries crocodile tears about Magnitsky, you have to remember that he was there only because Browder, by the way, during all the time, and this is attested to by somebody from one of the Russian human rights groups, while Magnitsky was in prison, Browder never, ever raised the question of his detention. Not once did he mention it. Only after he died did he mention the detention. So here's the story. Browder's story is that, and by the way, he changed the story. The first time, and this is all documented, Chatham House in London and the law school, San Diego Law School. This is documented in just after he died, and also in 2010, that Magnitsky was left in a room and nobody took care of him, and he died. Nothing about being beaten. Then he wanted to get the Magnitsky Act because the Russians were going after him for the 40 million, not just 40 million tax evasion. They discovered that he had illegally bought shares of Gazprom. Under the rules in Russia, only Russian nationals could buy Gazprom. Others had to get ADRs, which are American Depository Receipts, in London, and you could get them at a higher price and you could buy less of them. So Browder set up fake companies, shell companies, match, and bought shares of Gazprom illicitly. And so that was another deal. So when you put it all together, it looked like, some of the shares were bought for the Ziff brothers of Ziff. They were the heirs to the Ziff magazine fortune, and they were big donors to the Democrats. Mm-hmm. And so when you put them all together, it looked like it was about 100 million that he stiffed the Russians on. So that's why Magnitsky was being held. So he died, and they needed the Magnitsky Act to block any kind of extradition, and that's when, with the help of Jonathan Weiner, who had worked for the State Department and was working for an international PR firm whose another client was Khodorkovsky, and they got the Magnitsky Act passed. And by the way, the Magnitsky Act is not only that repeated all the lies about that Magnitsky was killed and Browder's the victim. It also said Khodorkovsky was a victim, and so they would fight extradition for Khodorkovsky, who had paid several $100,000 to lobby on this. So got what he paid for. But so what really happened? Well, one thing I would recommend that people see, and it's online, you can find it for free now. Andrei Nekrasov, a Russian, did a brilliant film called The Magnitsky Act Behind the Scenes. And he measured the cell, supposedly that eight government thugs entered the room and beat him with truncheons for over an hour. First of all, he found that 8 people could not fit in the cell. One. Then there were 2 independent reports about Magnitsky, which show the other part is a lie. The first one is by the Public Oversight Commission for Human Rights, which is a Russian NGO, which is charged with investigating prison conditions. And the other was the Physicians for Human Rights in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to which Browder had sent about 40 different documents, including the Russian Public Oversight Commission report. They did a report on November 16th, 2009. They said the death was supposed to be at 6:30 p.m. And their report is online, and I linked to it on my website. The death was 6:30 p.m. It was reviewed by the doctor on duty, and the diagnosis was acute cholecystitis and pancreatitis. And at that point, he had been, well, I'm sorry, wait a minute. The date of death, that wasn't when he died. That was the first thing in their report. So it was on the 16th, the day of his death. They said at 6:30, he was reviewed by the doctor on duty, and those were that's what they said. He was sent to the surgery department for monitoring and treatment. At 7 o'clock, their report says the patient behaves inadequately, talks to a voice, looks disoriented, shouts that somebody wants to kill him. His condition is diagnosed as psychosis. The emergency doctor is called, and the patient is, but there are no damages to him physically, except there are some on his wrists. Handcuffs were on the wrists, and he'd been banging on the door. And also on his ankles, he'd been kicking. There's metal doors, and he'd been kicking and banging on the doors. So they were going to do a certain kind of therapy, an anti-spasm therapy, but they couldn't do it because of his aggressive behavior. And then at 9:15, he was surveyed again, the deteriorating condition. The psychiatrist was examining him. He was transferred to a room where he received artificial ventilation of the lungs and a hormones injection. And that went on, well, and then for 30 minutes. Then at 9:50, he died. So the last time that he was seen to get that special reanimation was 9:15. 9:15 to 9:50 when he died is 34 minutes. That's not enough time for a more than 1 hour beating, is it?
No.
And then, I repeat that this report was done by an NGO, which is not a government agency, but which is a human rights NGO that looks into prison conditions. And that's their report. Now, there's another report, is Physicians for Human Rights in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Browder sent all the documents, and they, including this, the one I just described, they made a report. I linked to it on my website. No claims of a beating, 0 claims of a beating. As I said, the European Court of Human Rights also did not back up Browder's claims that Magnitsky had been tortured and beaten to death. And their report is also on my website. He made it up. Do you think anybody in the US Congress cares? No. You know, it's disinformation. It's propaganda. They buy into it. The other thing that I love, Browder faked a death certificate because he needed documentation, right? On the death certificate, it says closed cerebral cranial injury. And he highlighted that, and you couldn't read much on the rest of the death certificate. He put this on his website, and that's to prove Browder must have been beaten on his head.
Magnitsky.
I'm sorry, that Magnitsky must have been beaten on his head. except there was also, when I got the full, and Browder actually puts in the link at the bottom where you can get the URL, the full document. There's a line that says no sign of violent death detective, but he had made that illegible on what he put out. His mother, there was a forensic investigation, of course. Magnitsky's mother told the investigators, and this is in their report, that her son had fallen 16 years earlier, hit his head, suffered a concussion, which was treated, and the investigators found the medical reports. They included them in the forensic document. That's why there is a closed cerebral injury, but no sign of violent death. So the invention of the beating was an incredible fabrication, and therefore anybody, even if you just read a few of these things, you know that the guy's a con man. But there is not any interest in getting to the truth because it's convenient to the American, basically to the deep state that wants to use him as the first, what I call the first pillar of Russiagate.
Very good. That's very good. And I guess the last question that this sort of plays into, I suppose, in some ways, is in my mind. Well, actually, there's two questions. There's a sub question while you were speaking about Magnitsky's situation. Do you not think that, or what do you hypothesize, if you have any hypothesis about this? Do you think that Browder was not afraid that Magnitsky would maybe yap about?
Well, that's possible. I mean, he at a certain point might have felt that. Oh, because this is another interesting point. There's a guy named Oleg Lury, and it's interesting because when I was in Moscow and met John Helmer, I also met Oleg Lury, an investigative journalist. We were both looking into what seemed to be the theft of $4.8 billion lent by the IMF to the Russians, and it had gone through the Republic National Bank, and it seemed to have disappeared. And I went to see him because I knew that he was working on this story. Now, he was a very good investigative reporter. He did something where he was writing about a member of the Russian Duma who was a crook. So the Duma guy, with a collaborator, faked a story that Oleg Lury was trying to get a payoff from him not to write this stuff about him. And he was in the same detention place as Magnitsky. And there was a room where if you were being brought from your cell to maybe to a court appearance, a room to talk to your lawyer, for some reason there was a waiting room, a holding room. Well, one day, Magnitsky and Oleg Lury were in the same place. Oleg Lury was well known because he was an investigative journalist, and a lot of the inmates would come to him and ask for advice, and he was very smart and very helpful. So Magnitsky went to him and said, well, he's just there for a while because his employers are going to get him out. And then sometime later, Lury saw him again in that room, and Magnitsky was very depressed and said that they were betraying him. They'd been trying to get him to sign something which was going to accuse these Russian investigators of the fraud that Magnitsky and Browder had done. And Magnitsky knew very well who had done it. And but he was very, very upset. And clearly, he thought they were going to get him out. They must have promised to get him out, and they didn't get him out because they wanted him first to tell these lies. And I think that's part of the reason. Now, another point on the broader picture, which you're looking at, when I said the Browder hoax is the first pillar of Russiagate, well, that was in December 2012. And this is why it's important to the deep state. Then the next thing that happened was in January of 2017, the Office of National Intelligence released a report on Russia's interference in the U.S. presidential election. And it supposedly drew intelligence from the FBI, the CIA, the National Security Agency. It said that it had high confidence that Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign in 2016 aimed at the U.S. presidential election, including hacking of emails of party officials, etc. But then at the very end, it says, but we have no evidence. The last page, you must look at this report, which I linked to. The last page says, but we have no evidence. High confidence means they don't have, this is Intel speak for we don't have the evidence. Okay, the next thing was in December of 2017, so that's the end of that same year. Sean Henry is the president of CrowdStrike. It had examined the DNC computers, and he testified to the Schiff committee, that's Adam Schiff, because Schiff had been going around as the others had been, that these attacks on the emails of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, were done by the Russians. He actually testified to the Schiff committee that they didn't know who exfiltrated the emails. That was not revealed for a year and a half. And even then, in December 2019, the Washington Post was still reporting that CrowdStrike said that Russians were behind the hacking. And it was totally false, totally fake. Then we get the next pillar of Russiagate. This is going to have more than 4 pillars, is the investigation in the Mueller report, the Mueller investigation. And as we know, it went on for 2 years, and there was never any evidence that could be shown that there was a connection. That was in August of, that was in April of 2019. So that's a couple of years after these other events. There is no evidence that it can show. But interesting, they pointed out 5 key elements they were looking at. One of them was the Trump Tower meeting, and that again is the Browder story. And they did no real investigation. They just repeated all of Browder's lies, because this was an effort by the lawyer of Prevezon, which was the target of Browder's proxy case brought by the Justice Department. Preet Bharara was the U.S. attorney doing it, and he is a friend of Browder, and I believe very corrupt. And he brought this case. He's actually had Browder on a podcast and calls him his good friend. And when I tried to ask some questions in one of the programs they had where you could ask questions, they cut me off. And I have a copy of it, says, you have been cut off this program. He doesn't really want the truth. So this report, Mueller report, talks about the Trump Tower meeting. Natalia Veselnitskaya was the lawyer for Prevezon, a Russian company, which was targeted as having received money in this fake tax refund fraud, which we know was operated by Browder and Magnitsky. But they need to show, insist that other people are getting the money. And so she was the lawyer for this case. In the end, the Americans could not prove anything, and it was costing so much money to the Russian firm Prevezon, a real estate investment firm. They finally settled for $6 million. They didn't have deep pockets. If they really had evidence, the Justice Department would have gotten them with the evidence, and they would have had to pay a lot more, but they didn't. And so if you have deep pockets like the Americans, you will win over your targets. And then the last thing was the Durham investigation, which which shows that the Hillary Clinton campaign invented stories about Trump in Russia and shopped them to the FBI, which used them to attack people such as Carter Page, who were friends of Trump. So it basically it becomes both a political attack on the Democrats' enemies and an attack on the Russians, because we know that the deep state has been plotting really since the end of the Soviet state to go after Russia. Cheney talked about breaking Russia into 5 parts. They would all be 5 small parts. Yeah. And this is all part of that major campaign.
Wow. this is quite a comprehensive overview with many more points of intersection that I anticipated,
Hmm?
and I would imagine that this feeling is shared by many of the viewers here. I think that's probably actually one of the best ways to wrap this up, because frankly, I mean, there will be, I mean, maybe by the time people watch this, the elections will have already happened in the United States, probably, barring vast fraud, or worse. A new configuration of power, with new people coming in who are probably much more sympathetic to the type of story that you're putting out, especially in regards to the fallacies underlying Russiagate, and especially the fallacies of the Magnitsky Acts. Similarly, I mean, European governments have had their own, Magnitsky Acts embedded within their systems. Canada has obviously something very similar.
Hmm.
Is there any last words or advice you could give to incoming people who might find themselves with a bit of political clout very soon in new elections, but maybe not a lot of strategic knowledge of how to go about putting the brakes on or helping to shift the trajectory of the world that we're careening in towards a major confrontation with Russia and possibly even China, that maybe they could do something in regards to what you've just said pertaining to reversing the Magnitsky Acts and putting some sanity into the mix?
Well, one thing would be to show the falsehoods of these pillars of Russiagate. And you can go into every single one, and I've done a lot of that on my own website, and show that they're all these pillars are lies, and they were invented in order to promote a foreign policy, which is dangerous to us all, but it is desired by people in the deep state. So that would be one thing. The problem, of course, is the mainstream media is not interested in telling the truth about these cases, and that's why, so, and most of it, some of this stuff, it boggles the mind that people talk about, Putin has thrown out Browder. Putin, president of a country, do you think he really cares about some two-bit crook that stole a couple of $100 million? He doesn't. He's got other things to do. But Browder had to make himself be very important. Initially, he actually put up a document say all the reasons why Putin was great, why investing in Russia was great. He was basically trying to get on the good side of Putin, because that's how he operates. He either loves you or he kills you. And when Putin did not intervene, because this guy had been cheating the government of a lot of money, and so they threw him out. Putin doesn't. I do not think, because I don't know, and I don't say or write about what I don't know. Everything I said here specifically, I know, and I can document, and I have, and on my website I have links to everything. But I don't know who was the person or the office that decided not to renew Browder's visa. However, if an individual who owns a company has stolen, basically as cheated, $100 million worth, that's the money that they figure he should have paid for Gazprom if he was really buying Gazprom honestly, and the taxes. If you've cheated $100 million, why do you want that person in your country? I would think that person would be persona non grata, wouldn't you? A tax cheat? Why do you want him in your country? Does this have to go to the president? Do I want to allow in this guy who so far has cheated us of $100 million? Do we want to, what will he do if he comes back? And do you think he'll cheat us of another $100 million? Oh, that's an interesting idea. Let's try it out. Let's invite the crook Browder. Do you really want crooks in your country? The guy's a tax fraudster. He's a crook. That is why it's so interesting that this Canadian group of alleged very fancy high-level tax and auditors, analysts, have invited this tax fraud. How could you invite a tax fraudster to be your speaker? It's really surreal, but that's what they have done. And obviously, I wondered whether any of these. And by the way, this is being supported. This event is being supported by some national financial institutions, including I think it's the Royal, is it the Royal Canadian Bank?
I'm not surprised.
Or the Royal Bank of Canada, I forget what, but it's that the big bank, a very big bank, is the first on the website of this group. They are supporting it, and I wrote to them, both to executives and to the press representative about this case, and of course they didn't answer me. But it seems to me that, first of all, you're taking money from people who you are then auditing. Are you going to do some favors for those people? Is that why you're taking their money? Is that why they're giving you the money? But it shows to me the inner moral corruption, which of course is not surprising, of the financial industry and the people who are supposed to keep them honest. It shows their real corruption. How can you trust people who are accountants that invite a tax fraudster to be their main speaker? It is surreal.
Yeah. Well, again, the work that you've done since I guess the 80s, maybe earlier, on offshore banking and the international web of how the actual financial strings are pulled, has situated you in a very, very special and strong place to be able to cut through a lot of the surface stories of things. And I mean, I was surprised to discover not that long ago that when the Queen's official bank, Bank Quds, was found to be at the heart of major drug money laundering back in 2012. The publicity was so bad. I think they paid a few $1 million just to try to settle the case at a court or something, as is often the case. And then all of the offshore holdings of Bank Quds were purchased by none other than the Royal Bank of Canada. No evidence that any of that activity.
Well, that's the Royal Bank of Canada. That's who's sponsoring this event.
That's right. Yeah, that's what caused that thought to open up in my head. Yeah.
How crooked can you get?
No, it's lawful.
And there is an investigative journalist, a Canadian investigative journalist named Adrian Duplessis, wrote a very good, a long letter to this accountants group, which I posted on my website, detailing the corruption of Browder, and asking, why are you inviting him to speak? And of course, they didn't answer him. They have not responded to me on that, as I sent them all the details, everything documented. And so we see the corruption on all sides in the financial industry. And see, Browder takes advantage of that because the people who are supposedly the enforcers don't care about the corruption. They really care now about people in charge, care about his political role, and his political role is to attack Russia.
Yeah.
And even if the truth comes out, it comes out in a limited way, and often in media that is not seen by the masses of people. They just assume that the masses of the public will remain ignorant. Alas, they will.
Well, people have to expect a lot more of themselves these days. We're not going to be spoon-fed the truth in a world run the way ours is. So we have to seek it out a lot more than we might have thought we had to in previous, perhaps more sane periods in world history. So thank God for people like yourself who have chosen to step out of the official mold and stand for truth. And thank you so much for taking the time to really rigorously just go through this story. We're gonna have a lot of links. So please send me all of the links you think that should be placed in the description box, so people can do their own real rigorous research, documentaries, things you've written. Duplessis' stuff was an amazing document, as you said. I read it. It's rigorous as well, and everything you would want to know and more is located in that piece. I thank you so much. I think that we've just covered as many topics, and I think you've planted some seeds for hopefully a future conversation as well about offshore banking and some of the other work that you've been doing. If that's okay with you, I'll probably call upon you at some point soon. Okay. Thank you, Lucy.
It's my pleasure. It's been my pleasure.
All right. Take care now.